The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the small town in a quiet, peaceful glow. It was Christmas Eve, and the streets were lined with twinkling lights and decorations. Inside a modest little house, an elderly man sat by the fireplace, staring at the flames. His name was Thomas, and though the season was meant to be joyful, his heart felt heavy. For the past 30 years, Christmas had been a lonely time for him. He had no family to celebrate with, no children or grandchildren to share the warmth of the holiday. It was just him, his memories, and the silence of an empty home. Thomas had once had a family, a wife and 2 sons. But life had taken a cruel turn. A misunderstanding, fueled by pride and anger, had driven them apart. One argument, one moment of stubbornness, and everything had shattered. His wife had taken the boys and left, and Thomas, too proud to apologize, had let them go. Over the years, he had tried to find them, but it was as if they had vanished. Letters went unanswered, phone calls were never returned, and hope slowly faded away. Now, at 75 years old, Thomas often wondered if it was too late to make things right. He had spent decades regretting his choices, wishing he could turn back time. But the past was the past, and he had resigned himself to spending his remaining years alone. That is, until a small, unexpected event changed everything. Earlier that week, Thomas had been cleaning out his attic, sorting through old boxes filled with memories. Among the dusty relics, he found a small, worn-out shoebox. Curious, he opened it and discovered a collection of old photographs. There they were, his wife, smiling brightly, and his 2 sons, so young and full of life. The pictures were from a time when their family was whole, when laughter filled their home. As he flipped through the photos, his eyes landed on one in particular. It was a picture of his youngest son, holding a handmade Christmas ornament. Thomas remembered that ornament. His son had made it in school, and they had hung it on the tree every year until the family fell apart. Tears welled up in Thomas's eyes as he held the photo. He missed them so much. He missed the sound of their voices, the way his wife used to hum Christmas carols while baking cookies, the way his sons would run downstairs on Christmas morning, eager to open their presents. He missed everything. And in that moment, he made a decision. He would try one more time to find them. He didn't know where to start, but he couldn't let another Christmas pass without at least trying. The next day, Thomas went to the local library. He had heard that people sometimes used the internet to find lost loved ones, and though he wasn't very good with computers, he was determined to learn. The librarian, a kind woman in her 40s, noticed Thomas struggling and offered to help. When he explained his situation, her eyes softened with sympathy. She sat down with him and showed him how to use social media and search engines to look for his family. Hours turned into days as Thomas searched tirelessly. He looked up old addresses, contacted people with the same last name, and even joined a few online groups for people searching for lost family members. It was exhausting, but he didn't give up. Then, one evening, just as he was about to call it a night, he found something, a profile on a social media site. The name was different, but the face was unmistakable. It was his youngest son, now a grown man with a family of his own. Thomas's heart raced as he stared at the screen. This was it. This was his chance. With trembling hands, Thomas typed out a message. He introduced himself and explained who he was. He apologized for everything that had happened and expressed how much he missed his family. He ended the message by saying that he didn't expect forgiveness but hoped they could at least talk. Then, with a deep breath, he clicked send. The days that followed were agonizing. Thomas checked his phone constantly, hoping for a reply. But there was nothing. Doubt began to creep in. Maybe his son didn't want to hear from him. Maybe it was too late. Just as Thomas was about to lose hope, his phone buzzed. It was a message. His hands shook as he opened it. The message was short but filled with emotion. His son had written back. He said he had often wondered about his father and that he was willing to meet. Thomas's heart swelled with relief and joy. After 30 long years, he was finally going to see his family again. The meeting was set for Christmas Day. Thomas spent the next few days preparing. He cleaned the house, baked cookies, and even dug out the old Christmas ornaments, including the one his son had made all those years ago. He wanted everything to be perfect. As he hung the ornaments on the tree, he couldn't help but smile. For the first time in decades, he felt a glimmer of hope. Christmas morning arrived, and Thomas woke up early. He put on his best suit, made sure the house was spotless, and waited. The hours seemed to drag by, but finally, there was a knock at the door. Thomas took a deep breath and opened it. Standing there was his son, now a man in his 40s, with his wife and 2 children. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, with tears in his eyes, Thomas stepped forward and hugged his son. It was a hug filled with 30 years of regret, love, and longing. And in that moment, Thomas knew that this was the greatest Christmas gift he could ever receive, the gift of family. The reunion at the door was emotional, but it was just the beginning. Thomas stood there, holding his son tightly, as if letting go would make him disappear again. His son, now a grown man with streaks of gray in his hair, hugged him back just as fiercely. Behind him, his wife and children watched quietly, their eyes wide with curiosity and a touch of nervousness. The younger boy, no older than 8, tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Is that Grandpa?" She nodded, her own eyes glistening with tears. Thomas finally pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Come in," he said, his voice cracking. He stepped aside, and the family walked into the house. The warmth of the fireplace and the scent of freshly baked cookies filled the air, but the real warmth came from the smiles and the tentative laughter that began to break the ice. They sat in the living room, the Christmas tree twinkling in the corner. Thomas couldn't stop staring at his son. He looked so much like his mother, the same eyes, the same smile. It was like looking into the past. "I can't believe you're here," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've missed you so much." His son nodded, his own emotions clearly visible. "I've missed you too, Dad," he replied. "I didn't know if I'd ever see you again." The conversation started slowly, with small talk about the weather and the drive over. But soon, they began to open up. Thomas's son explained what had happened after they left. His mother had taken them to another town, where she worked hard to provide for them. She never spoke much about Thomas, and as the years went by, the boys stopped asking. Life moved on, and the past became a distant memory. But deep down, Thomas's son had always wondered about his father. He had questions, regrets, and a longing to understand what had gone wrong. Thomas listened intently, his heart aching as he realized how much pain his actions had caused. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I was too proud to admit it back then, but I've regretted it every single day since. I should have fought for you, for all of you. I'm so sorry." His son reached out and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "It's not just your fault, Dad. Mom had her part in it too. We all did. But it's in the past now. What matters is that we're here, together." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. Then, Thomas's grandson, the younger boy, spoke up. "Grandpa, did you really make these cookies?" he asked, holding up a half-eaten cookie. His innocent question broke the tension, and everyone laughed. "I did," Thomas said, smiling. "And I've got more in the kitchen. Would you like to help me decorate some?" The boy's eyes lit up, and he nodded eagerly. Thomas led him to the kitchen, where he had set out bowls of icing and sprinkles. As they worked together, the boy chattered away, asking questions about Thomas's life and telling him about school and his favorite toys. Thomas listened, his heart swelling with love for this little boy he had just met. Meanwhile, in the living room, Thomas's son and daughter-in-law talked quietly. "This is surreal," his son said, shaking his head. "I never thought this day would come." "It's a good thing," his wife replied, squeezing his hand. "He seems like a kind man. And look how happy the kids are." As the afternoon turned into evening, the family gathered around the table for Christmas dinner. Thomas had gone all out, preparing a feast of roast turkey, mashed potatoes, and all the trimmings. As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily. They talked about their lives, their jobs, their hobbies. Thomas learned that his son was a teacher, just like his mother had been. He felt a surge of pride hearing about the lives his children had built. After dinner, they moved back to the living room, where Thomas brought out a box of old photo albums. Together, they flipped through the pages, laughing at old hairstyles and reminiscing about happier times. Thomas's son pointed to a picture of himself as a little boy, holding the handmade Christmas ornament. "I remember making that," he said, smiling. "I can't believe you kept it all these years." "Of course I did," Thomas replied. "It was always my favorite." As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew more relaxed. The children played with their new toys, and the adults talked late into the night. But as the clock struck midnight, Thomas's son stood up. "We should probably get going," he said. "It's a long drive back." Thomas felt a pang of sadness, but he nodded. "Of course," he said. "But before you go, there's something I want to give you." He went to the tree and carefully took down the handmade ornament. "This belongs to you," he said, handing it to his son. "I've kept it safe all these years, but it's time for it to go back to its rightful owner." His son took the ornament, his eyes filling with tears. "Thank you, Dad," he said. "This means more to me than you know." They hugged again, and this time, it felt like a new beginning. As Thomas watched his family drive away, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in decades. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was full of possibilities. And for the first time in 30 years, Thomas went to bed on Christmas night with a heart full of hope and love. The days following Christmas were a whirlwind of emotions for Thomas. He couldn't stop thinking about the reunion with his son and his family. The house, which had felt so empty for so long, now seemed to hum with the echoes of laughter and conversation. The handmade ornament his son had taken with him was a symbol of their reconnection, and Thomas found himself smiling every time he glanced at the tree, now missing that one special decoration. But as the initial joy settled, Thomas began to feel a new kind of restlessness. He had his son back in his life, but there were still so many unanswered questions, so many years to make up for. He wondered about his older son, the one who hadn't been at the reunion. Where was he? What had happened to him? And what about his ex-wife? Thomas knew he couldn't truly move forward without addressing the past fully. He needed to find them too. One morning, as he sat by the window with a cup of tea, Thomas decided to take the next step. He picked up his phone and called his youngest son. The call was answered on the second ring. "Hey, Dad," his son said, his voice warm and welcoming. "How are you?" "I'm good," Thomas replied, though his voice betrayed his nervousness. "I was wondering, do you know where your brother is? Or your mother? I'd like to see them too, if they're willing." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I haven't spoken to my brother in a few years," his son admitted. "We kind of drifted apart after Mom passed away." Thomas's heart sank. "She's gone?" he asked softly. "Yeah," his son replied. "It's been about 5 years now. She had cancer. She fought it for a long time, but in the end," his voice trailed off, and Thomas could hear the sadness in it. Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. He had always hoped to apologize to her, to make things right. Now, he would never get the chance. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't know." "It's okay, Dad," his son said gently. She had a good life. She was happy, especially after she remarried. She always said she didn't have any regrets. Thomas nodded, even though his son couldn't see him. "What about your brother?" he asked. "Do you think he'd be willing to talk to me?" "I'm not sure," his son admitted. "He's always been more reserved than me. But I can give you his number. It's up to you to reach out." Thomas wrote down the number, his hand shaking slightly. After the call ended, he stared at the piece of paper for a long time. This was it. This was his chance to reconnect with his older son. But what if he didn't want to talk? What if the wounds of the past were too deep to heal? Taking a deep breath, Thomas dialed the number. It rang several times before a deep voice answered. "Hello?" "Hi," Thomas said, his voice wavering. It's your father." There was a long silence on the other end. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. Finally, his son spoke. "What do you want?" The words were cold, but Thomas didn't let them deter him. "I want to see you," he said. "I want to apologize for everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'd like the chance to explain." Another pause. Then, his son sighed. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "Please," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I've missed you so much. I just want to see you, even if it's just once." There was a long silence, and for a moment, Thomas thought his son had hung up. But then he heard a quiet, "Okay. I'll meet you. But I'm not making any promises." Thomas felt a surge of relief. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you so much." They arranged to meet at a small cafe in the city where his older son lived. Thomas spent the next few days preparing himself mentally. He knew this meeting wouldn't be easy. His older son had always been more sensitive, more affected by the family's breakup. Thomas could only hope that, after all these years, there was still a chance to mend their relationship. The day of the meeting arrived, and Thomas drove to the city with a mix of hope and anxiety. The cafe was cozy, with soft lighting and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. Thomas spotted his son immediately. He was sitting at a corner table, his face serious but not unkind. He looked so much like his mother, with the same sharp features and thoughtful eyes. Thomas approached the table slowly. "Hi," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His son looked up and nodded. "Hi." They sat in silence for a moment, neither sure of what to say. Finally, Thomas spoke. "I'm so sorry," he said. "For everything. I know I hurt you, and your brother, and your mother. I was selfish and stubborn, and I've regretted it every day since." His son looked down at his coffee, his expression unreadable. "It's not that simple," he said. "You don't just get to say sorry and expect everything to be okay." "I know," Thomas said quickly. "I don't expect that. I want you to know that I'm sorry. And that I love you. I've always loved you." His son sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's hard, you know. Growing up without a father. Watching Mom struggle to raise us on her own. I always wondered why you didn't fight for us. Why you didn't care enough to try." Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes. "I did care," he said. "I cared so much. But I was scared. Scared of rejection, scared of failure. And by the time I realized how wrong I was, it felt like it was too late." His son looked at him, his eyes searching Thomas's face. For the first time, Thomas saw a flicker of vulnerability in his expression. "It's not too late," he said quietly. "But it's going to take time. I can't just forget everything that happened." "I understand," Thomas said. "And I'm willing to wait. However long it takes." They talked for hours, about the past, about their lives, about the pain and the regrets. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of tension and anger. But by the end of the conversation, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. His son hadn't forgiven him yet, but he was willing to try. And for Thomas, that was enough. As they left the cafe, his son turned to him. "I'll call you," he said. "We'll talk again." Thomas nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I'd like that." The drive home was filled with mixed emotions. Thomas knew that rebuilding his relationship with his older son would take time and effort. But for the first time in decades, he felt like he was on the right path. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still unwritten. And Thomas was determined to make the most of it. The weeks following the meeting with his older son were a mix of hope and uncertainty for Thomas. They had agreed to stay in touch, but the conversations were still awkward, filled with long pauses and hesitant words. Thomas knew it would take time to rebuild the trust that had been broken, but he was willing to put in the effort. Every phone call, every text message, was a small step forward, and he cherished each one. Meanwhile, his relationship with his younger son and his family continued to grow. They visited him regularly, bringing laughter and life back into his quiet home. His grandchildren, in particular, had taken a liking to him. The younger boy, who had helped him decorate cookies on Christmas, often asked to hear stories about the old days. Thomas loved sharing his memories, even the painful ones, because it helped him feel connected to his past and his family. One weekend, his younger son suggested they all take a trip together. "There's a small town a few hours away that has a winter festival," he said. "I thought it might be fun to go as a family. What do you think, Dad?" Thomas's eyes lit up at the idea. "I'd love that," he said. "It's been years since I've been to a festival." The day of the trip was cold but clear, with a bright blue sky that made the snow sparkle. Thomas bundled up in his warmest coat and scarf, feeling a sense of excitement he hadn't felt in years. His son drove, while his daughter-in-law and grandchildren chatted happily in the back seat. Thomas sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window and marveling at how much his life had changed in such a short time. The winter festival was everything Thomas had hoped for and more. The town square was filled with stalls selling handmade crafts, hot cocoa, and festive treats. There was a carousel for the children, a bonfire where people gathered to warm up, and even a small ice skating rink. Thomas watched as his grandchildren ran from one attraction to the next, their laughter ringing out in the crisp winter air. At one point, his son suggested they all go ice skating. Thomas hesitated. "I haven't skated in decades," he said. "I'm not sure I remember how." "Come on, Dad," his son said with a grin. "It's like riding a bike. You'll pick it up again in no time." With a little encouragement, Thomas agreed. He laced up a pair of skates and stepped onto the ice, holding onto the railing for support. At first, he wobbled and stumbled, much to the amusement of his grandchildren. But slowly, he began to find his balance. By the end of the hour, he was skating, slowly but surely, around the rink, his laughter mingling with theirs. As the day turned to evening, the family gathered around the bonfire to roast marshmallows. Thomas sat between his son and daughter-in-law, watching the flames dance and feeling a deep sense of contentment. This was what he had been missing all those years, the simple joy of being with family, of sharing moments and making memories. On the drive home, Thomas's younger son turned to him. "Dad, I've been thinking," he said. "Why don't you come stay with us for a while? The kids love having you around, and it would be nice to have you closer." Thomas was touched by the offer, but he hesitated. "I don't want to be a burden," he said. "You're not a burden," his son replied firmly. "You're family. And family takes care of each other." After some thought, Thomas agreed. He packed a bag and spent the next week at his son's house, enjoying the hustle and bustle of a busy household. He helped with homework, played board games, and even taught his grandchildren how to make his famous cookies. It was a stark contrast to the quiet solitude he had grown used to, and he loved every minute of it. During that week, Thomas also had a chance to talk more with his older son. They spoke on the phone several times, and though the conversations were still a bit stiff, they were getting easier. His older son even mentioned the possibility of meeting in person again, this time with his own family. Thomas felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could all come together as a family again. As the week came to an end, Thomas returned to his own home, feeling rejuvenated and hopeful. He knew there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was full of possibilities. And Thomas was determined to make the most of it, one step at a time. That night, as he sat by the fireplace, Thomas pulled out an old photo album. He flipped through the pages, smiling at the memories. Then, he reached for a blank page at the back of the album. He carefully placed a photo from the winter festival there, a picture of him and his family, smiling and laughing together. It was a new memory, a new beginning. And as he closed the album, Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude. After 30 long years, he had finally found his way back to his family. And he wasn't going to let go again. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change for Thomas. His life, once quiet and predictable, was now filled with the noise and joy of family. He spent more time at his younger son's house, becoming a regular presence in his grandchildren's lives. They called him Grandpa with such ease, as if he had always been there, and Thomas couldn't help but feel a deep sense of belonging. But it wasn't just his younger son's family that brought him happiness. His older son had started to open up more, too. They spoke on the phone regularly, and the conversations were becoming less awkward, more genuine. One evening, his older son surprised him with an invitation. "I'd like you to come visit," he said. "I want you to meet my family." Thomas was overjoyed. "I'd love to," he replied without hesitation. "Just tell me when." The visit was arranged for the following month. Thomas counted down the days, his excitement growing with each passing one. When the day finally arrived, he packed a small suitcase and made the drive to his older son's home. It was a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, but to Thomas, it felt like the most important place in the world. His son greeted him at the door with a cautious smile. "Welcome, Dad," he said. "Come on in." Thomas stepped inside, his heart pounding. The house was warm and inviting, filled with the sounds of children playing. His son's wife came forward to greet him, her smile kind and welcoming. "It's so nice to finally meet you," she said. "We've heard a lot about you." Thomas shook her hand, feeling a lump form in his throat. "It's nice to meet you too," he said. "Thank you for having me." Then, his grandchildren came running into the room, 2 boys, around the same age as his younger son's children. They stared at him with wide eyes, curious but shy. "This is your grandpa," his son said, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "Say hello." The boys mumbled their greetings, and Thomas smiled warmly. "It's so nice to meet you both," he said. "I brought some cookies for you. Would you like to try one?" The mention of cookies broke the ice, and soon the boys were chatting excitedly as they munched on the treats. Thomas felt a sense of relief. This was going better than he had dared to hope. Over the next few days, Thomas got to know his older son's family. They showed him around their town, took him to the park, and even let him help with a school project. Thomas was amazed at how much his son had grown, not just in age, but in character. He was a devoted husband and father, patient and kind, and Thomas felt a surge of pride. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Thomas and his son sat on the porch, sipping hot cocoa. The air was crisp, and the stars shone brightly overhead. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, just enjoying each other's company. Then, his son spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about the past," he said. "About what happened between us. And I realized something. Thomas turned to him, his heart in his throat. What's that? I've been holding on to a lot of anger, his son admitted. Anger at you, at Mom, at the situation. But I don't want to be angry anymore. It's not helping anyone, least of all me. Thomas nodded, his eyes filling with tears. I understand, he said. And I'm so sorry for everything. I wish I could go back and change it, but I can't. All I can do is try to make things right now. His son looked at him, his expression softening. You're already doing that, he said. Just being here, trying to be part of our lives, it means a lot. Thomas reached out and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Thank you, he said. That means more to me than you know. The rest of the visit passed in a blur of laughter and shared moments. Thomas felt like he was finally getting to know his son, not just as the boy he had left behind, but as the man he had become. And in turn, his son was beginning to see Thomas not just as the father who had been absent, but as the man who was trying to make amends. When it was time to leave, Thomas hugged his son tightly. Thank you for this, he said. It's been wonderful. It has, his son agreed. Let's not wait so long before we do it again. Thomas nodded, his heart full. I'd like that. As he drove home, Thomas reflected on how much his life had changed in such a short time. He had gone from being alone to having not just one, but two families who loved and cared for him. It was more than he had ever dared to hope for. But there was still one thing missing. One person he hadn't been able to make amends with, his ex-wife. Though she was gone, Thomas felt a deep need to honor her memory, to acknowledge the role she had played in his life and the lives of their children. When he got home, he took out a box of old letters and photographs. Among them was a picture of his ex-wife, taken on their wedding day. She looked so young, so happy. Thomas stared at the photo for a long time, his heart aching with regret and love. Then, he took out a pen and paper and began to write. He wrote about his regrets, his mistakes, and his gratitude for the life they had shared, however briefly. He wrote about their children, and how proud he was of the people they had become. And he wrote about his hope that, wherever she was, she could forgive him. When he was finished, Thomas folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. He didn't know where to send it, so he decided to keep it with the photo. It was a small gesture, but it brought him a sense of peace. As he sat by the fireplace that night, Thomas felt a deep sense of closure. The past couldn't be changed, but he had done everything he could to make amends. And now, he was ready to move forward, not just for himself, but for his family. The journey wasn't over, but Thomas knew he was on the right path. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. As spring turned to summer, Thomas's life continued to blossom in ways he had never imagined. His relationships with both of his sons grew stronger, and he found himself spending more and more time with their families. He became a regular at family gatherings, birthday parties, and school events. His grandchildren adored him, and he adored them right back. For Thomas, every moment with them felt like a gift, a chance to make up for the years he had missed. But even as he reveled in the joy of his newfound family, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more he could do. He wanted to honor his ex-wife's memory in a meaningful way, to ensure that her legacy lived on in the hearts of their children and grandchildren. After much thought, he decided to organize a family reunion, a celebration of their shared history and the love that had brought them all together in the first place. He brought the idea up to his sons during a weekend visit. I was thinking, he said, that it might be nice to have a family gathering. A chance for all of us to come together and remember your mother. What do you think? His younger son nodded enthusiastically. I think that's a great idea, Dad. It's been a long time since we've all been in the same place. His older son, who had been quieter, looked thoughtful. It would be nice to honor Mom, he said. She would have loved seeing everyone together. With their support, Thomas began planning the reunion. He chose a date in late summer and rented a small park pavilion for the event. He reached out to extended family members, cousins, aunts, uncles, and old friends who had been part of their lives before the family had fallen apart. Many of them were surprised to hear from him after so many years, but they were eager to come and reconnect. As the day of the reunion approached, Thomas felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He wanted everything to be perfect, but he also knew that emotions might run high. This wasn't just a celebration, it was also a chance to heal old wounds and build new connections. The morning of the reunion dawned bright and clear. Thomas arrived early to set up, hanging photos of his ex-wife and their family around the pavilion. He had also brought a box of mementos, old letters, handmade ornaments, and other treasures from their life together. As he arranged everything, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. This was his way of saying thank you, to his ex-wife, to his sons, and to the family they had created together. Soon, people began to arrive. His younger son and his family were the first, followed by his older son and his. Then came cousins, aunts, uncles, and old friends. The pavilion filled with laughter and conversation as people hugged, shared stories, and caught up on decades of missed time. Thomas stood back for a moment, watching it all unfold. His heart swelled with emotion as he saw his sons talking and laughing together, their children playing nearby. It was a scene he had once thought impossible, and yet here it was, real and beautiful. After everyone had eaten and mingled for a while, Thomas stood up and tapped a spoon against his glass to get everyone's attention. The crowd quieted, and all eyes turned to him. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "This day means so much to me, and I know it would have meant a lot to her too." He gestured to the photos of his ex-wife. She was an amazing woman, strong, kind, and full of love. And even though she's no longer with us, her spirit lives on in all of us. He paused, taking a deep breath. "I know I made mistakes. I let my pride and fear get in the way of what really mattered. But I'm here today to say that I'm sorry, and to thank you all for giving me a second chance. This family is my greatest gift, and I'm so grateful to be a part of it again." There were tears in many eyes as Thomas finished speaking. His son stood up and hugged him, and soon others joined in, offering words of encouragement and love. It was a moment of healing, of forgiveness, and of hope. The rest of the day was filled with joy. People shared stories about Thomas's ex-wife, laughing and crying as they remembered her. The children played games and explored the park, their laughter echoing through the trees. And Thomas, surrounded by the people he loved, felt a deep sense of peace. As the sun began to set, the family gathered for one last group photo. Thomas stood in the center, his arms around his sons, their families gathered close. It was a picture of love, resilience, and the power of second chances. That night, as Thomas drove home, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. He had found his way back to his family, and in doing so, he had found himself. But even as he celebrated the present, Thomas knew that the future held more possibilities. There were still stories to share, memories to make, and love to give. And he was ready for all of it. As he pulled into his driveway, Thomas glanced at the passenger seat, where a single photo from the reunion lay. It was the group photo, everyone smiling and happy. He picked it up and smiled. This was his family. This was his life. And he wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. The reunion had been a turning point for Thomas. It wasn't just an event, it was a celebration of healing, forgiveness, and new beginnings. In the months that followed, Thomas felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a man living in the shadow of his past mistakes. He was a grandfather, a father, and a cherished member of a family that had welcomed him back with open arms. As the seasons changed and the air grew crisp once more, Thomas found himself looking forward to the holidays with an excitement he hadn't felt in decades. Christmas had always been a bittersweet time for him, a reminder of what he had lost. But this year was different. This year, he had a family to share it with. His younger son had invited him to spend Christmas at their house, and Thomas had gladly accepted. He arrived on Christmas Eve, his car filled with gifts and a box of homemade cookies. The house was already bustling with activity when he walked in. His grandchildren ran to greet him, their faces lit up with excitement. "Grandpa! You're here," they shouted, pulling him inside. The house was decorated from top to bottom, with twinkling lights, a towering Christmas tree, and stockings hung by the fireplace. The smell of cinnamon and pine filled the air, and Christmas carols played softly in the background. Thomas felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. That evening, the family gathered around the tree to exchange gifts. Thomas watched as his grandchildren tore open their presents, their eyes wide with wonder. When it was his turn, he handed his younger son a small, carefully wrapped box. "This is for you," he said. His son opened the box and pulled out the handmade Christmas ornament, the one his son had made all those years ago, the one Thomas had kept safe for decades. His son's eyes filled with tears as he held it up. "Dad," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You kept it all this time?" Thomas nodded. "It's always been my most treasured possession," he said. "But now, I think it belongs with you." His son hugged him tightly, and Thomas felt a surge of love and gratitude. This was what Christmas was all about, not the gifts or the decorations, but the love and connection they symbolized. Later that night, as the children slept and the adults sat around the fireplace, Thomas's older son arrived with his family. It was a surprise, one that brought tears to Thomas's eyes. "I couldn't miss spending Christmas with you," his older son said as they embraced. The two families came together, filling the house with laughter and joy. They shared stories, played games, and even sang carols together. Thomas sat back, watching it all unfold, his heart full. This was his family, whole, happy, and together at last. As the night wore on, Thomas found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. It hadn't been easy. There had been pain, regret, and moments of doubt. But through it all, there had also been love, love that had endured despite the years and the distance. Love that had brought them back together. Before bed, Thomas stepped outside for a moment to take in the quiet beauty of the night. The snow was falling softly, blanketing the world in a peaceful silence. He looked up at the sky, where a single star shone brightly. It reminded him of the star that had guided him back to his family, the hope that had kept him going even in his darkest moments. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was thanking, the universe, his ex-wife, or maybe even himself for not giving up. Whatever it was, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The next morning, Christmas Day, was filled with even more joy. The children woke up early, eager to see what Santa had brought. The adults followed, sipping coffee and watching as the kids played with their new toys. Thomas sat by the tree, a cup of hot cocoa in his hands, feeling a sense of contentment he hadn't known in years. As the day went on, the family gathered around the table for Christmas dinner. Thomas looked around at the faces of his loved ones, his sons, their wives, his grandchildren. He felt a lump form in his throat. This was his family. This was his life. And it was more beautiful than he had ever imagined. After dinner, they all sat in the living room, the fire crackling and the tree lights twinkling. Thomas's younger son stood up and raised his glass. "I'd like to make a toast," he said. "To family. To love. And to second chances." Everyone raised their glasses, and Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes. "To family," he echoed, his voice trembling. "To love. And to second chances." As the night came to an end, Thomas sat by the fireplace, his heart full. He thought about the past, the present, and the future. He thought about the journey that had brought him here and the love that had guided him every step of the way. And as he sat there, surrounded by the people he loved most in the world, Thomas knew one thing for certain: this was the greatest Christmas gift he could ever have asked for. It wasn't just the reunion or the forgiveness or the joy. It was the knowledge that, no matter how far apart they had found their way back to each other. And that was a gift that would last a lifetime.